Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the director, Susan Weber, and Dean Peter Miller. I'd like to welcome those of you here in the room tonight to the Bard Graduate Center for the Paul and Irene Hollister Lecture on Glass. Additionally, I would like to welcome those who are watching us online via our live stream site, BGC TV, and to remind you that you can post questions and comments on Twitter using the hashtag @BardGradCenterTV. The Paul and Irene Hollister Lecture on Glass are made possible through a generous endowment from Irene Hollister in memory of her late husband Paul. So we'd like to extend a special thanks to Irene Hollister for making tonight's lecture possible. Tonight's presenter, Dr. Ines Rotermund-Reynard, will speak for us on beads and buttons from Briare, a global industrial success story from the 19th century in France. Ines Rotermund-Reynard is an associate member of the research lab CEPA, Culture Esthétique et Philosophie de l'Art, at the University of Paris, Panthéon-Sorbonne, and an associate lecturer in the art history department at the University of Cologne. She received an MA in Art History, General Rhetoric and German Literature at the University of Tübingen, Germany, a French MA at the University of Paris 8, and a binational PhD at the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales, Paris and Freie Universität Berlin. She taught German studies and 20th century art history at the University of Lille 3 and the University of Paris 1, Panthéon-Sorbonne. Her main research field are exile studies and provenance research. She's at present the recipient of a fellowship from the Thyssen Foundation to write a biography of the German Jewish art critic Paul Westheim. As a postdoctoral research fellow of the German Historical Institute in Moscow, she worked on the archives of German-speaking artists, writers, and critics exiled in Paris in the 1930s archives that had been seized first by the Nazis and then transported to Moscow by the Red Army. The upcoming publication Echoes of Exile, Moscow Archives and the Arts in Paris, 1933-1945, edited by Ines Rotermund-Reynard and Walter de Gruyter, examines these previously unknown sources. The topic on beads is a kind of outcome of gatherings we had and interest in a very personal history of which Ms. Rotermund-Reynard will give us some insight tonight, and I'm very happy that this event is possible. And please join me in welcoming Ines Rotermund-Reynard. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Ulrich. I am delighted. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be at the Bard Graduate Center tonight. And I would especially thank the director, Susan Weber, the Dean, Peter Miller, and Irene Hollister for inviting me. And of course, Marc Leblanc, who is sitting here somewhere, for organizing this evening. So thank you very much for coming. Where is she? Can we start the... Okay, here you go. So the material I want to talk about this evening is actually known by all of you, at least if you've been to Paris in the last 50 years. Maybe you didn't see it consciously. Maybe you didn't touch it. But you must have walked over it. Yeah. Ah, ça change pas. Here we go. Thank you. Both the Parisian Orly Airport, inaugurated in 1961, and Terminal 1 of the Roissy-Charles de Gaulle Airport, in operation since 1974, had floors covered by mosaic tiles called Briare. This material became very popular in the 1960s and 70s. Their form, in the shape of round pastilles, corresponded to the dynamic pop art movement of those years, when the belief in industrial and economic progress was the order of the time. In the 60s, Orly Airport was not only an airport, but the symbol of French modern style and architecture. Movie stars had their photos taken there, and the construction served as a decor for many films of the Nouvelle Vague. On the weekends, thousands of Parisians and tourists spent their free time on the open-air terraces of the building. The French chansonnier Gilbert Bécaud composed the famous song Dimanche à Orly, and it's hard to imagine, but Orly Airport was the monument the most visited in France, 3 million visitors in 1963, more than the Tour Eiffel. Actually, these small little mosaic tiles from Briare have been used for over 130 years in decoration, architecture, and in the arts. Before going into the main subject of today's talk, I would just like to show you some of the most popular sites and artworks using these mosaics. You can find mosaics from Briare in the nave of the Montmartre Basilica in Paris and in the church Notre-Dame de la Garde, symbol of the city of Marseille. Many train stations are decorated with these small tiles, like the famous Gare de Lyon in Paris, inaugurated in 1901, and which still preserves a perfect example of the architecture and decoration of the Belle Époque. Along the facades or the side of the station, coats of arms and mosaic represent the main French cities. The original swimming pool in the Parisian Art Nouveau Hotel Lutetia opened its doors in 1935 and was covered in granito and émaux de Briare in dark green, blue, black, and gold. The pool itself closed in the 70s, but the whole ensemble can still be imagined today as the place became the Parisian flag store of the famous French brand Hermès. In 2010, when Hermès moved in, the original floor of the pool was recovered with new mosaics, but around the edges of the flooring, as on the columns, as you can see here, one can still recognize the former decoration composed of Briare tiles. In 1892, the Art Nouveau artist and decorator Eugène Grasset designed the mosaic pediment of the church Saint-Étienne in the town of Briare, as well as most of its floral decoration. And 70 years later, Victor Vasarely, French inventor of op art, chose the same material to create his oversized wall installation, his so-called monument, such as À l'homme venal hors manipure, that aimed to illustrate sonatas by Johann Sebastian Bach. The Briare Museum conserves today 3 models of these artworks, while the originals are exposed in Vasarely's own foundation in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. The colors of Briare tiles also inspired Venezuelan kinetic artist Carlos Cruz Diaz for his conception of the floor for the Caracas airport, which plays with abstract geometric forms and creates a sensation of motion. And in the United States, the tiles from Briare have recently been used, for example, at the Pittsburgh airport by architect Tasso Katselas, and for the renovation of the Olympic swimming pool of Los Angeles, as well as for Marlins Park, the baseball park in Miami, whose construction was completed in 2012. So what we just have seen gives you a glimpse of what Briare is today. But how did it all begin? Who created these famous mosaic tiles? Who invented their forms and colors? So let's dig up the tiles and see how and when this fascinating story of material culture started. I will now go back in the 19th century origins of the factory of Briare, this little French town located south of Paris on the banks of the Loire River. But to begin, I would like to quote the great philosopher Walter Benjamin, who was both a keen observer and a brilliant analyst of the smallest historical detail. Benjamin was especially interested in rubble and remnants. He wrote, and I quote, "The rubble of great construction speaks to us more impressively of its plan of construction than an edifice of lesser value, even well preserved." End of quote. And as you will see, I too am personally interested in remnants and rubble. And my research actually began several months ago when I discovered some Briare remnants on the Parisian flea market, a handful of beads which I knew had been made in Briare. I was astonished to find them, as the bead production had stopped 40 years ago and they had become rare. I asked the dealer where he had found them. He said, "In the forest." I said, "Are you kidding?" He said, "No," and he made me a little drawing showing me the way to get there. So I took my treasure map, and I went to the forest of Briare. So let's have a look what you can find there. In the forest, a huge area is covered by tiles. Surrounded by trees and small ponds, you step onto the old, now abandoned, dump site of Briare's factory. 100 years of remnants of the most impressive producer of mosaics in France. And the more you shove aside the broken, ordinary white tiles, the more shapes and colors you will find. And the deeper you dig, the more different objects you will find. Hidden beneath and between millions of mosaic tiles, you'll find examples of the original product of the factory, beads and buttons. Both the bead and the button are made out of the same material as the mosaic tiles. The French name émaux de Briare might create some confusion. Émaux refers to porcelain enamel in English. This material is made by fusing powdered glass to a substrate, which is then fired. While the English term is usually used to name only the coating on metal, glass, or ceramics, the French term émaux de Briare means the entire object is made out of enamel. The English research literature on our subject speaks of porcelain or Prosser beads. The basic material of these beads and buttons is a cold paste, which is molded under great pressure and then fired. The ingredients of this paste were clay or some other earthy material, flint and feldspar, but also soda and quartz sand. Contrary to other types of porcelain, the ingredients were molded in a dry state and no heat was used during the process of shaping. The original purpose of this technique, invented by the Prosser brothers in 1840 in England, was to produce buttons. The paste mixture only allowed the realization of opaque colors. That's why the finished product is often compared to porcelain. The author Flor Caspers, who published a little handbook about the beads from Briare in 2011, explains, quote, "The technique and the end result of the bead production can be seen as somewhat in between glass and porcelain. Depending on the mix of ingredients and the use of feldspar as the main ingredient, the product is closer to glass or porcelain." And as with most stories of inventions, many persons are involved and many elements, But in one moment, one person brings everything together and develops a whole new idea, a whole new industry. In France, it was Jean-Félix Baptis who invented this new manufacturing process, which transformed porcelain paste into thousands of different forms and colors and made it possible for them to be exported all over the world. Jean-Félix Baptis was born in 1813 in Briare, a small village close to Paris. He grew up in modest conditions and at a very young age started to work as a mechanic in his father's studio. Very talented, at the age of 20, he invented different patents for weapons and lamps. Fascinated by steam engines, he worked on a project for a high-speed locomotive, but without necessary funding, was only able to build a small model of it. His fascination for automatic machines led him on a trip to England in 1843 to visit the first button-making factories of Minton and Chamberlain, where the Prosser method was applied. There he was surprised to see that this machine could only produce one button at a time. Once back in France, Baptis improved the Minton-Chamberlain system and patented a machine able to produce 500 buttons at a time. In cooperation with his brother, Jean-Frédéric Baptis, who was a chemist, he also improved the quality of the paste by incorporating milk in it. In 1844, the year of its invention, the button press machine received the gold medal from the jury of the Industrial Exposition in Paris. Encouraged by this decoration, the Baptis brothers started their own button business in Belleville, at that time a suburban village of Paris. 2 years later, they had to move. The success of their buttons obliged them to rent a bigger place for the production. They moved to downtown Paris, Rue de la Muette, now Rue Léon Freud, in the 11th arrondissement. They enhanced the collection by launching the new Strass button model, named after the Alsatian jeweler George Friedrich Strass, who had the idea of imitating diamonds. This model was made by covering the colored paste with a shiny surface that produced the illusion of valuable material. Baptis constantly improved his production, enlarging the color range and experimenting with the first mechanical impressions of button decors. I am showing you an original sample card from the Briare factory, presenting a series of buttons, probably from the end of the 19th century. The French Dictionary of Inventions in the Science, in the Arts, and in Industry, published in 1860, explains how Baptis developed the whole process of production, checking every little detail so as to obtain the most perfect result as possible. Quote, the paste for the agate, I show you a detail here. The paste for the agate buttons is composed of feldspar cleansed with acids to get rid of the iron oxide. The paste for the strass buttons is composed of feldspar and a little milk so that it can be more easily molded after drying. One press can mold up to 500 buttons at a time, and the worker who operates it can strike on the average 2 or 3 times in a minute. A single oven can fire 500 masses of buttons in 24 hours, and in that time burns approximately 6,000 kilos of coal. One worker tends each oven and works 12 consecutive hours. End of quote. La masse was a traditional measuring unit for beads and buttons. One masse was equal to 1,728 beads or buttons. The subcategory of the mass was la grosse, which represented 12 dozen. One mass represented 12 gross. This meant that one worker could produce 36,000 buttons per hour. So per year, the Parisian Baptis factory produced 600 tons of buttons. And this first stage of industrialization, of course, had a lot of impact on price policy. In a few years, the price of buttons decreased drastically, whereas a set of buttons presented on cards cost 8 francs per mass in 1845. By the 1850s, Baptis was selling them for approximately 1 franc 75. We learned from the same dictionary that Baptis improved not only the original machine for pressing the buttons, but also the machines for grinding the raw material, the mills to grind the colors, the instruments to manipulate the burning hot oven plates, and the machines to pierce the cards on which the buttons would be sewn and which later served as presentation cards. At the end of the 1840s, 700 persons worked for the factory in Rue de la Muette in Paris. 400 women were employed in their homes to sew the buttons onto the sample cards. Sewing was the only step of the production which was not mechanized. The invention of the industrialized button press by Jean-Félix Baptis completely ruined English button production. Minton left the button business to concentrate on high-quality china, and Chamberlain had to sign a commercial agreement with his French competitor, allowing him to use the Baptis patents in return for royalties. In the 1840s, the French capital was characterized by political instability. After 18 years in power during the so-called July monarchy, King Louis Philippe had to abdicate in 1848, the year of the February Revolution. A series of unsuccessful rebellions by Parisian workers against the conservative turn of the Republic ended in the suppression of these revolutionary movements. By the end of the year, Louis Napoleon was elected president of the Second Republic. After only 4 years, he established the Second French Empire in 1852, which lasted until 1871. The unstable political climate probably played a role in the decision of Jean-Félix Baptis to leave Paris and to move his factory to the provincial town of Briare. But the main reason was certainly his phenomenal economic success in the button business, which forced him to look for new production site. In 1851, he decided to buy a porcelain factory in Briare that was not profitable at the time, but possessed the coal ovens he needed. The geographical situation of Briare was perfect for his project. 150 kilometers south of the French capital and located on the banks of the Loire River, it promised an ideal infrastructure for his trade. The factory possessed a steam engine which could easily be supplied with coal from the nearby Massif Central, which could also deliver wood. Baptis improved the installations so that the manufacturing process could function with coal until the end of World War II. The French author Pascal Nourisson summarizes the technical capacity of the factory in her book, The Industrial Adventure of the Briare Factory. She says, quote, in 1893, the consumption of coal was estimated at 10,000 tons and that of wood at 500 cubic meters. This meant a total of 800 horsepower, end of quote. The Loire River and the whole system of canals ensured the transport of raw materials and final productions. Baptis extended the water access to the factory, as you can see on the postcard below. Where am I? Here. So that the canal barges could navigate to the doorsteps. the main raw material for the production, feldspar, was brought in from Norway. At the end of the 19th century, the Baptis family became the holder of these Norwegian mines to ensure the quality and the delivery of this essential material. For more than a century, Briare would be the territory of the Baptis Empire. Jean-Félix moved there with his family. His wife and 2 daughters, a 3rd daughter and a son were born in Briare. His parents and his older brother, Jean-Frédéric, the chemist. The 2 brothers still formed a tandem, completing each other with their inventions. In the beginning, the family clan lived together in the main house called La Grande Maison on the property of the factory. Today, La Grande Maison has become the museum of the Émaux de Briare. Jean-Félix Baptis was the perfect example of 19th century French bourgeois patriarch who started from nothing and who, thanks to economic success, became a powerful landowner with huge real estate investments. To control and ensure every step of his production, he bought a farm that provided the 500 liters of milk he needed daily for his production. He opened a brickyard and acquired 30% of the non-constructed land from the commune. He had his own personal homes all over in France. In Paris, he built a Haussmannian building for his parents and the families of his 3 daughters. And as the brilliant observer Walter Benjamin noted with his usual perspectiveness in his short text, Paris, Capital of the 19th Century, Paris in those days was a sort of a stage set, its decor a reflection of economic power dressed up in false appearances. Benjamin wrote, quote, "The phantasmagoria of capitalist culture attains its most radiant unfolding in the World Exhibition in 1867. The Second Empire is at the height of its power. Paris is acknowledged as the capital of luxury and fashion." End of quote. Baptis was not only attended this universal exhibition where countries were represented by their national architecture, he actually bought the Norwegian pavilion after the exhibition and rebuilt it in Briare. I'm sorry not having a picture of it, it got destroyed after. The family dynasty was reinforced by his 3 sons-in-law as his own son died at a young age. The Baptis daughters and their families built 3 castles in Briare. I'm only showing you 2 of them, as the biggest one got destroyed in the 70s of the 20th century. And wait, I couldn't get the picture of it. So one castle became an exposition place for the community of Briare today, and the other one a private hotel. And as befitted their social standing, the family spent their winters at the seaside in Normandy or on the Riviera in their Villa de Lys in Cannes. But this personal investment shows only one side of Baptis' financial engagement. Jean-Félix was the patriarch of his family, but he also became the patriarch of his factory and of its town, Briare. During his reign, the population of Briare nearly doubled. Before Baptis arrived, Briare had 3,400 inhabitants. In 1881, there were 5,600. At that time, 50% of the population worked directly for the Baptis factory, and many others were indirectly dependent on this powerful businessman, either delivering materials or supporting the infrastructure. Even in the neighboring communities, thousands of people worked for the factory. In most households, women and children were sewing buttons and beads on sample cards. So it is not astonishing that at his peak, Baptis had up to 10,000 employees. The patriarch also invested in social constructions. He financed 2 primary schools and 1 kindergarten. The school was located right next to the factory in such a way that the children, some of whom started to work at the age of 11, had only to pass through the door, which meant leaving the schoolroom and starting their work at the factory. Nevertheless, concerned by the health of his workers, he developed a system of social health care for them, as well as a construction plan for a hospital with free medical service for his workers. The hospital was built by his descendants, as Jean-Félix Baptis died in 1885. Baptis himself had a very modern housing system built for his workers. Each family had an apartment, a small garden for vegetables, and could use communal showers, baths, laundries, and bread ovens. So we can have a look on this photo. All this is the factory. The main house, which I showed you before, is here surrounded by trees. And what was really new for his time was this construction of the 3 lines of the houses for the workers, with the gardens in the middle. Here below you have the new hospital, which was built in the end of the 19th century. And of course over there, the Loire River, with the famous bridge, which I talk about it later. And in the middle of the old part of the town, the church constructed by the Baptis family. As a practicing Catholic, Baptis planned to build a new church in the center of the town of Briare, but he didn't have the time to see his plan carried out. His family had the new church built between 1890 and 1895. I will show you this church again. It was built in a Roman Byzantine style and is actually an immortalization of the Baptis mosaic dynasty. The family financed the whole project. Art Nouveau decorator Eugène Grasset designed the facade mosaics, the entire floor decoration, and elements of the altar, as well as the models for the stained glass windows. So here we have some details from the floor decoration in the church. So we remember that it was Jean-Félix Baptis' old dream to construct a high-speed locomotive. He never fulfilled this dream, but in a certain way he himself became this high-speed locomotive, developing and supervising his circle of acquaintance. With a passion for new inventions, he didn't miss a chance to be the first by creating new technology. He arranged for a train station to be built in Briare, allowing the town to be connected to the new French railroad network. In 1860, he was one of the pioneers to test a new product, tar, a new covering for roads, which would permit more rapid transportation. And he also was a main supporter of the huge project for the construction of this famous Pont Canal, a bridge for boats that served as a side canal, allowing them to navigate over the Loire. In 1896, the first boat crossed the bridge, which became an important transport connection between the Loire and the Seine River. Another famous 19th century engineer, Gustave Eiffel, participated in the construction of this famous bridge, which remained the longest metallic canal bridge in the world until 2003. Baptis' paternalistic lifestyle focused on the town of Briare, but that didn't prevent him from keeping the headquarters for the international business of his factory in Paris. In 1878, he constructed this building at number 4850 Rue de Hauteville in the center of Paris, where he established the head offices, a shop, the merchandise depot, and 46 apartments for his Parisian employees. And it was from there that the worldwide beads and button business was directed. Baptis had begun to produce beads in 1864, a time that corresponded with the ideology and policy of European colonial expansion, and which intensified from 1870 on. And it was mainly Africa that became the prime target of the new imperialist expansion. People have used beads for trade since the earliest time. And from the 15th century on, during the period of exploration and colonization, and especially in Africa, the trade bead was the most widely used material for negotiating raw materials like gold, ivory, oil, and raw iron. On the same trade routes where for centuries gold and ivory were being transported and exchanged for beads produced in Europe, one of the darkest chapters of African and European history was taking place. From the 16th century until the mid-19th century, the slave trade was supplied with thousands of tons of beads from Venice, Bohemia, Holland, and Germany. When Baptis began producing beads, slavery had been abolished since 1848, but the European nations were beginning to compete in the race for colonization. A friend of Baptis, who was commercializing his own products, encouraged him to get into the bead business. He wrote, quote, "An agent who works in Egypt showed your white beads to his client in Alexandria. He only said 2 words, grande affaire, big business." One has to remember that metallic currency was not used and not even popular in 19th century Africa. Economic exchanges were carried out mainly using textiles, shells called cowries, or glass beads imported from Europe. The Baptis bead rapidly became very popular in all African regions. In the chart, it remained the smallest unit of official currency until 1945, parallel to the silver thaler Marie-Thérèse. One source reports that in 1910, the thaler had a value of 3 francs, which was equal to 40 necklaces of Baptis. In the next part, which focuses on the African bead trade, I will be referring to the research of Pascale Nourrisson. I have already mentioned her book on the history of the factory, but she also published a short article about African trade with beads. And I'm especially grateful to Paola Carlet of the Museum of Briare, who aided me in my research, as well as her director, Monsieur Keraguat, who oversees today's mosaic production in Briare. Thanks to them, I was authorized to do research in the archives of the museum, which gave me a deeper understanding of the whole story and especially of the bead trade with Africa. African regions, in particular those that had known the slave trade, remained especially interested in and dependent on beads. Missionaries and explorers very quickly understood that they couldn't survive without beads to pay salaries, to obtain travel authorizations, or just to buy food. One traveler in Africa reported, I quote, "In French Congo, salaries and services are almost all paid with glass jewelry. In general, that means beads called angeses, cylindrical beads in a white opaque color, and Baptis beads in white, blue, or red." French explorer Émile Gentil, traveling in Africa in 1896, explains, "At the Nindies, a tribe from Congo, a chicken is exchanged for 2 teaspoons of beads." And in 1910, a certain Captain Cornet refers to the following prices. A chicken costs 3 necklaces and a fish 4, whereas you can buy 10 tubers of manioc for only 1 necklace. The success of every exploration mission depended on the quantity and quality of beads that the Europeans exported to Africa. The same Émile Gentil wrote in his report dated from the end of the 19th century, quote, "We would soon be short of the beads we used to pay to our food. What could we do? Those beads that were almost the sole means of exchange were indispensable." Most research literature on trade beads refers to the extensive history of Venetian beads, especially the Millefiori, which was extremely popular for centuries. Author Hollister, author of the book The History of Beads from 30,000 BC to the present, first published in 1987 and still considered the Bible of bead history, underlines the importance of Venetian glass beads as well as glass beads from Bohemia. Both places produced thousands of tons of beads, which were exported to Africa beginning in the 15th century. She also mentions that most of the agate and carnelian beads found in Africa were produced either in India or in Ida Oberstein, this German town specialized in the production of stone beads in the 19th and 20th centuries. It is surprising, though, to see that the Baptis bead production isn't even mentioned in her book, since the French producer clearly played a central role in the African bead trade from the mid-19th century on. In their short article, The French Connection, first published in 1995 and now online, Jean and Ruth Picard, bead collectors and founders of the Carmel Bead Museum in California, mentioned this subject for the first time. After visiting Briare and its newly opened museum, they advanced the argument that the Briare bead production is still not recognized for its important role in the cultural history of beads. And they write, quote, "Today, this type of molded bead is related, and its related articles are too rapidly classified as Czech, and although a good production of them were made there, the Prosser bead seems to have been pioneered and made in a lot of varieties by Baptis. His place in the history of beads has been greatly underestimated." End of quote. Baptis was not only the pioneer of these colored Prosser beads, but the quality of the French product was never matched by the Czechs, who began to copy the Baptis production after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. This conflict and the following economic difficulties weakened Briare's production for a while. The Czechs took advantage of it and brought workers from Briare to Bohemia. Nevertheless, a report from the Compagnie Française de l'Afrique Occidentale on 30 years of missions in Africa underlines this difference. Quote, "The most appreciated because of their quality, their forms and colors, were the beads from the factory of Baptis in Briare, used all over in Black Africa. Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Italy also produced beads, but preference was always given to France. Its quality and colors were never matched by the others. This is due to three essential components, and especially to the scent of Fontainebleau, exclusive to our country." End of quote. This testimony might not be the most objective, as it comes from the French company itself, but if we look closer of the palette of the Briare beads, it is evident that his production was of especially high quality and displayed a wide variety of forms and colors. So Prosser beads can be recognized, as you can, I hope you can see that, especially on the part below of the picture of the photo. Prosser beads can be recognized by the typical equatorial band separating the two parts of the beads. This band is clearly perceptible, and if you touch them, I brought you some examples, so I invite you after the conference to touch them. And if you touch them, you can feel this unevenness. The end sides of the beads are usually flattened and a little bit rough. As I mentioned earlier, all Prosser beads were made by pressing a cold and moist paste into a mold. They were then fired on a flat surface in a kiln. so it is evident that this technique would leave traces on the final product. Most of the time, this band is not polished off, but sometimes it is, which makes it extremely difficult to determine the origin of the bead. By introducing different metallic oxides into the paste, the Briare method could develop a wide range of colors which were dewed in the mass. In 1885, more than 50 different pastes were prepared, making it possible to create more than 250 models of beads, each manufactured in about 10 different series. In 1950, although the bead business was slowly passing out, the factory still proposed 1,800 series of beads. Different blues were obtained by introducing cobalt salt oxide or zinc oxide. By adding chromium oxide, green colors were obtained, and nickel oxide gave yellow and iron chromate brown. One might imagine that thousands of tons of simple colored beads were only produced to earn money as fast as possible and to easily conquer the African continent. However, it is interesting to note that the African clients were extremely demanding, as each tribe had its own symbols regarding colors and shapes. As Paola Carlet remarks in her research on the Briare bead in Africa, I quote, "More than the aesthetic value, it was the symbolic meaning of the beads which was essential in Africa. Beads were symbols of wealth and prestige. They indicated the social status of the person wearing them, and the more beads you had, the greater your prestige in the group." It was the African client who decided what kind of beads were to be produced in French Briare. And each foreman at the Baptis factory had a schedule with all the various dates of cultural and religious events in all the African colonies. For example, the girls from Upper Volta got married in July and attired themselves in white beads specially produced by Baptis for this occasion. In the Lake Chad Basin, located in northern Central Africa, the Muslims demanded beads, quote, "in the skin color of Miriam, daughter of the Vadai Sultan, head of a former kingdom to the east of Lake Chad." This again meant that they only wanted specially colored white beads from Baptis. And as reported by George Briare, geographer and administrator of colonies in 1918, the Chad women wore strands of clear blue, dark blue, and white Baptis beads around their waist. The more they had, the wealthier they were. In 1893, Jean Dubovsky, who explored the Congo and Chad, wrote about the difficulties of choosing the right type of bead to bring with on his missions, as a certain color or shape would obtain the favor of a whole tribe, while another tribe wouldn't even look at it. French explorer Pierre de Brasseur brought with him 5,500 kilograms, 5.5 tons of Baptis beads when he traveled to Central Africa in 1893. He refused black beads as the natives could not bear this color. It is interesting to note that he also mentioned that the natives refused imitation coral, which Baptis had started to produce. The subject of replicas or copies deserves some special remarks. Baptis was a good businessman and rapidly developed different kinds of copies of expensive or original materials, which could only be designed elaborately by hand, like stones or shells. The ones I show you here are his copies of the Haishi bead, which could also resemble striped agate beads. Originally, Haishi beads were disc or tube-shaped beads made of organic shells or ground and polished stones. They came from the Santo Domingo Pueblo Indians in New Mexico. The name Hishi means shell beads in the language of Santo Domingo Indians. Baptis produced these cylindrical beads in black or brown with white stripes. But once he had developed a new type of bead, he simply produced it in all kinds of colors, as you can see in this picture. I have already mentioned the agate or carnelian stone beads made in German Ida Oberstein. I will now show you an example of a typical carnelian bead on the left and a Baptis replica of it on the right. And as you can see, there is resemblance in shape, but the color has been freely applied. Fathat beads were very popular in Europe. Originally made in stone, they were copied in glass by the Czechs. The ones I'm showing you here were found on the factory's dump site in Briare. So they obviously come from there. But this type of bead is extremely close to the Bohemian one, so that it is almost impossible to determine their origin. These zigzag-shaped beads interlock with each other, and the ensemble resembles a necklace of snake vertebrae. They were popular in Nigeria and were produced in Bohemia, in Germany, and in France, probably between 1920 and 1960. Baptis made two models of the snake bead, one with 4 points and one with 3 points. The French model has a sharper and longer point than the one of the other companies. On our photo you can see the 4-point model, and I'm also showing you a presentation of Briare beads from the museum collection, and you can see it's like the third strands from the above, donc showing two-tone strands from in the snake bead model in blue and yellow. Another one item of typical South Saharan jewelry is this ornament called talakimt or tanfuk. Talakimts are very popular in Tuareg culture. Originally made in silver, ordinary metal, or soft stone, the ornament is suspended from the neck or fixed on a veil on the forehead or in the hair. Baptis produced his talakimt model in various sizes and colors. The sample cards that I found in the basement of the Briare Museum also show the different types of his talakimt models. And here you can see an African woman with different types of talakimt ornaments in her hair, fixed in her hair. Beside these examples, Baptis tried to copy and sell amber, coral, and Russian blue beads, wooden prayer beads, and chevron beads. He also designed a lion's tooth for the African market, as well as a deer teeth for the American Indians. So obviously all these colorful items were not destined for the European client. To satisfy European women, he invented a special machine which could cover plain beads with a brilliant substance, giving them the illusion of value. This is the machine which is now displayed in the Briare Museum. The beads were put into the globe made of copper. A liquid similar to mother of pearl was poured into the globe, and thanks to the centrifugal movement and the chemical process, the beads were covered with a shiny glaze. As real pearls were extremely fashionable in 19th century European culture, but also very expensive, his fake pearls had a certain success. These are examples of beads for the European market that show this kind of imitation pearl finish, as well as other examples, which I already showed you, destined to the European women. And to end this short presentation of different types, color types, I will show you a last photo from the museum selection of Briare, showing you that he also imitated gold and silver beads by giving them a metallic coating. The English word bead has its etymological origin in the Old English word gebet, which meant prayer, close to the Old High German word beta, which became bitte, as it is the usual word for conversational request, please. German, as well as French and Italian, lost this old meaning for bead, and the only word used today is die Perle in German, la perle in French, and perla in Italian. So only the English language retained the difference between the actual pearl and the bead. The shift in meaning came via beads threaded on a string to count prayer stanzas. For centuries, beads were specifically produced for rosaries. And as you can imagine, Baptis didn't miss the specific market, which he could even develop in his own country, in France. In south-central France, the town of Chaise-Dieu is famous for its 14th century Gothic pilgrimage church. And in the area around this town, a rosary manufacturing business developed. I was very lucky because we found this original build from the Baptis factory written in 1896, saying that the Maison Ouvrier Tissier from the town of Ambert ordered 150,000 beads from the Briare factory. Ambert is located a little north of Chaise-Dieu in the Auvergne, and as I was traveling in the region last year, I stopped in Ambert. And there I discovered an antique shop with a huge stock of Baptis small prayer beads. The shop owner had bought the old depot of a rosary factory in the region, which had recently closed down. She confirmed me that for centuries rosaries had been produced in the region and that Baptis factory had delivered those prayer beads to Ambert for over 100 years. So this is a photograph which I took in the basement of her shop, where you can see this wonderful bead depot, and as well as this original burlap sack in which the beads had been transported. And you can see the FB for the Felix Baptis on it, as well as the black star, the logo for the packaging bags. And to end this little sub-chapter, I just want to show you these two examples for Muslim rosaries. Because finally, even though Baptis was a practicing Catholic, as we said before, he was first of all a businessman and had no problem adopting his range of prayer beads for Muslim rosaries. Here's an example of these misbahas or tasbish, I hope I pronounce it well, as well as a sample card with minaret elements for the Muslim rosary. All these items are made out of émaux de Briare and are conserved in the archives of the museum. I'm coming to my conclusion. My research began with a questioning of the material object itself. I was trying to understand how its expressive character reflected the portrait of society. The bead was a visual form from which, in the words of George Kubler, a shape and time could emerge. And analysis of the characteristics of the material itself showed that it had been artificially made, fabricated by a newly invented process. And that, thanks to 19th century industrialization, it had then been produced in thousands of different forms and colors. Jean-Félix Baptis was a perfect example of 19th century French bourgeois patriarch who understood the science of his time and who conquered the world economically with his product. In this short talk, I have focused on the African market, but Baptis exported his beads and buttons to the United States and South America, as well as to some Asian markets, especially Japan. Whenever he arrived in a new country, he applied for a patent, as you can see in these documents, showing the American as well as the Japanese patent for the Baptis button machine. His economic strategy corresponded to the new 19th century religion, the commodity. As Walter Benjamin noticed in the above quoted text, Paris, capital of the 19th century. Go back. The whole society got transformed and followed the new dogma to buy and possess things. And I quote Benjamin again, "Word exhibitions are places of pilgrimage to the commodity fetish. Objects began to lose their authentic value in terms of utility and became pure products, imitating original materials, like the buttons we saw earlier that were covered with a shiny surface and give them the illusion of value, but that had only been created to correspond to an ever-renewed ritual of fashion." The Baptis buttons and bead production transformed the whole town. In the 19th century, Briare was named La Ville des Perles, the town of beads. For more than a century, generations lived from this business. But after World War II, it became a running out production. The invention of the automatic washing machine and its widespread installation in individual households in the 1940s and 50s brought the Baptis button production to an end. The porcelain broke in the metallic tumble machines, and the plastic button replaced it rapidly. The bead production also slowed down after the war. In 1959, 98% of the production at the Baptis factory consisted on tiles. African countries started to revolt against colonial power, and in the 1960s, most of them became politically independent. The Briare bead production stopped definitely in 1974. But by analyzing 19th century rubble and remnants, we also learned that although the product was cheaply produced and distributed on a massive scale, it underwent a process of acculturation. African tribes had no difficulty accepting these thousand-fold reproduced beads. They didn't question the loss of the aura, as Benjamin did when describing the difference between the original artwork and its technical reproduction. On the contrary, the African people ordered beads in bright colors and varied forms, as they needed these beads in order to exist. Men and women dressed up with them. These beads became part of their culture, social and religious identity. The colors spoke to them. Beads were language, and the beaded object was much more than finery that obeyed an individual aesthetic criterion. Beads represented a form of expression in the community and accompanied their wearers in all phases of their lives: childhood, warrior or hunter age for men, adulthood, and marriage for women. As a young African woman who was not yet married didn't wear the same colors around her waist as a married one. Although beads became the currency of the colonized African territories, in most cases the family store of beaded object was carefully preserved and transmitted from one generation to another. their symbolic character was considerable, and they played an important role in most rituals. Some French explorers reported that in certain African territories, notables were buried in standing position in the middle of tons of beads. And to end my talk, I'm showing you this wonderful photo from a book on textile art made by the African contemporary artist and fashion designer Lee Dumas. She inherited the embroidery art from her grandmother and is developing it in her own style. And if you look closer to this picture, you see the ranges of necklaces the model is wearing. And you then recognize the typical equatorial band of the Prosser bead. So this detail, as well as the deep blue color, is referring to our beads made in French Briare. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ines, for this wonderful talk. And now, ready for questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes, please.
Two questions. One is, are you publishing anything on this? And my second question is, who's going to go do the archaeology at the dump? Because I'm volunteering.
I'm sure there will be some volunteers. I think it's, well, first question, I have no idea. This was really kind of a project because I'm, as you can imagine, I'm a bead collector since the age of 4. So it was just a fascinating story. So it was great to come here. There is not, for the moment, there's not a project to publish, but I hope there will. And to answer your second question, I don't know. It's amazing because you can, I mean, remember the picture, the photo of the whole territory of the manufacturer, and actually what I understood now, I think the dump site in the beginning was water. So I think there must be like tons and tons and tons of beads in the water. And then, because this is why maybe I didn't show a good picture, but if you step into the forest, you have all these trees, but lots of ponds around. So I don't know, I don't remember who told me that, but apparently 150 years it started just, they just throw the bad stuff in the water and then it grew up and grew up. I didn't know, but it's a great place.
Any other question?
I have some African beads that are glass, dark blue, beautiful color, something like no glass, but it is absolutely replication. It gives, I forgot to show you. It gives all kind of aqua, almost green. Do you know anything about them? I'm curious.
I have no idea. I think you should look at it, but I think if you're saying it's lots of reflection and a little bit transparent, maybe, or not?
Not really transparent. They are cut in diamond, how do you call it? Hexagon, yes, shape. And they just reflect like a real reflet metallic. It looks like.
Yeah. I don't know. You should look at it. But usually, as I think I tried to show, that were really kind of simple replicas he did, and most more elaborated material, that's not a Prosser bead, that's not Baptis. I mean, he was really kind of a China production in the 19th century.
That's why.
I just, maybe there's one bead I think of, one, as I said, I think he also copied the Russian blue bead, which was a kind of a very dark blue,
yes,
and a little bit facette.
Yes,
I couldn't show you a picture because I didn't have actually a good original example of it, but that might be possible, yeah.
Any?
I'm interested in this covering over of the surface, which is the name of the game in the 19th century, when there were all of these inventions that were about surfaces and
Yes.
transforming things to look like something else. And I'm wondering how long this lasts in the bead and button, the bead trade. Is this something that it goes on through the 20th century, or is this something really specifically in the 19th century? In this case.
Well, I think in this case it's really especially 19th century, but for sure it lasts until maybe the 2030s. But when it's very difficult actually to date these sample cards, but there's never a date on it. But I remember I saw some sample cards from the 50s, 60s, and you really see the difference in very bright colors, very, pop colors, and you don't have this covering anymore.
So are they then trying to emulate bakelite and other kinds of substances that are different from what would have been available in the 19th century? I mean, they're trying to do pearls and diamonds and...
I think it was more like, the important material and backlit. They're not proud to say that, but actually in the 50s there was one small temptation to also get into the plastic business, but I only saw one small sample card which was hidden in the basement, and I don't think that really they wanted to listen about to all kind of plastic, synthetic material. No, they were very fidel, how do you say, loyal to the material. Mm-hmm.
But I think it's not yet explored. I thought it's metal buttons, and it was actually glass covered like metal.
Yeah.
Well,
So however they did this,
you should touch it that because so it gives you a better idea.
Another question I saw there. Yes,
Yes,
please.
thank you. With regard to the buttons, would you mind repeating the distinction between whether they were glass or china?
I think nobody knows. This is why I quoted this author, Frau Kaspers, who she published a very small little handbook, which is a nice introduction to the Briar bead and button. And I think it's still kind of a secret. Nobody really knows it. As she said, depending on the feldspar, if there's more or less feldspar in it, and so actually it's not very clear. The people call it porcelain beads, but it's more close to glass.
I think more research should be done in the reports, technical reports, which you can find in the Musée des Arts et Métiers, for example, some place like this. But this is really, when Ines showed me the button collection, how she had found them during a dinner in Paris, I said this is something for BGC, because this is really like material culture in the world coming from a little place, being dumped out in France, and also completely forgotten in France itself. That's very often that we find objects or history which actually in the country from where it's coming or originating from is completely obliterated and forgotten, and you have to bring it to another place to kind of rediscover it. So
Because the Berber stuff is full of this, right? And the Yves Saint Laurent, the museum in Paris now must have all these Berber clothes with French beads, and no one knows, right?
yeah, once you see it, I mean, also when you come up now, I mean, you found things even on eBay, and you can now detect them. I mean, you can find this from your New York apartment if you know how to identify the stuff. This is a very interesting.
Oh, I just because on Sunday I went to this little flea marketplace, which you
in the
25th Street, I think, where there's one African guy, or originally African, he's American, of course. And I found these, and these are all prosobeads. You can feel the difference, It's really, you can compare, and I'm sure this is Briare because it's exactly the blue. I have the other examples from which are newer, but directly from France. And if you touch it, you feel the difference. Well, of course, as I said, the Czech, they copied this technique. But if you look at the colors, and this was hidden under the table. It was not exposed, in the first place. But it's interesting, yeah.
Yes, please.
You talked about how Baptis used a milk product in his formulas, and I wonder whether the German and Bohemian, in a sense, reproductions or derivatives, whether they also incorporated that milk product, or whether that might have made a difference in the appearance and why Baptis might have been more able to hold the colors or have that deep opaque color that they do.
Yes. I'm sorry, I think I can't answer that because it's still also kind of a secret, because even if I try to talk to the people working in the museum in Briar, and as the mosaic production still goes on, and for example, I asked, is there a possibility to visit the factory, to really look how they work and it's very difficult to get into. And I'm sure they copied also this technical part, because this was already published, for example, in the Dictionary of the Arts, which I quoted, which was published in 1860. So it was known that there was this milk thing. And after the crisis, after the war, 1870, as I said, some Briare people went to Bohemia to work there. So I'm sure they kind of also copied really technical designs. And what I didn't have the time to mention is also interesting, because we always look at all these producers as concurrents, but there were many moments where they tried to organize themselves together. For example, there's a very interesting document in the archives from 1913, where all these people, the Czech ones, Rettelhammer, Riesler from Germany, Schenk, I think he was in Aachen, Brabdors, and an Italian guy, they tried to sign a kind of a commercial agreement and on prices, and it was a very European document, you know, written in French and in German, but that was 1913, and then the First World War broke out. And then it lasted another 20 years, where they finally signed something in the 1930s, but then there was a Second World War. So it was not only, you know, they also tried to organize themselves worldwide and together. But that's for the 20th century, not for 19th.
Just curious, is it basically the same process? Are they using the same process now with the tiles as they used with the beads? Or have they
in a way, that's what I wanted to just kind of perhaps as a conclusion also, because why does different countries all over the world still go to Briare? Because even if the champ d'application, you know, the field of utilization has changed to kind of tiles and these floor tiles and everything, there must be something special about it that you find from Ecuador to LA, you know, and when you know them, you know the colors, and we all have used floors and bathrooms in France, you know that they are very different, and they have something very perky and very colorful about them. Perhaps this is still the secret. We saw YouTube, or where did you show me this? There's on YouTube, there are some films, how they were made. But of course they don't give you the formula how they do them. But it's a really special process, an industrial process to produce them. And there must be some magic or some hidden secret side, which they probably very carefully keep in order to keep their
Yes, and I remember also there's another interview which you can find on the net with Monsieur Carwat, the director of the mosaic tiles Briare today, and he explains that of course they are still all over the world market, especially also in Arabic countries for mosques. But not the only, but of course there's a huge concurrence, especially from China, but it's really a question of quality. I think this is really the point.
This is why Briare kind of still outstanding, eh? It's kind of still nothing itself.
Oh yeah, of course.
Great. Yeah, last question?
In the museum and archives, were you able to see any evidence that any of the production tooling, the die sets, and the methods by which they were constructed have been preserved?
No, I didn't see that. The only thing which you can see in the museum from the machine, you can see the button machine, the press machine, and there's also one example of these machines which pressed the holes in the beads. But actually they sold all them in the 60s, 70s when they stopped the bead production to Morocco. But then there was one when they wanted to open the museum in the 1990s, they got one back and they restarted, because actually in Morocco they never used it. So, but no detail, I'm sorry. No.
Great, thank you very much.
You should come here and please touch them to feel really the process